Part 2, Big Ideas. The South China Sea.
This process of recapitalization of militaries over the last decade and a half is basically a move from small coastal-oriented militaries to militaries that at least have more potential for forward defense, for force projection, firepower, and even to a certain extent stealth. And let me just tackle a few of these on one at a time. Singapore. What you've seen is since basically around the late 90s is moving from basically small, fast attack craft to acquiring frigates. These were from France. Getting submarines from the Swedes, used, of course, but refurbished. The interesting thing, of course, is that before they bought these submarines, they didn't have a submarine force. So they basically created one out of whole cloth. They've also built some force projection ships, LPDs, and in general the assumption is that they're trying to build a highly networked modern Navy, one that can interoperate with each other and also jointly operate with the air and ground forces of the Swedish military, or Singapore military, excuse me. To a certain extent, not to be outdone, the Malaysians have also engaged in a certain amount of procurement in the last decade. They wanted to acquire couple of dozen of these so-called offshore patrol vessels, which are based on a German corvette design. They plan to acquire some what they call littoral combat ships. They certainly have the requirement to build up their Navy and their Coast Guard with additional power projection ships. Some frigates, but again, too, they had no submarines, and then in recent years they've actually taken delivery of two of these so-called Scorpion-class submarines, which were built by the Franco-Spanish consortium. The interesting thing to note about these is they can actually fire encapsulated Exocet, which is an anti-ship cruise missile, through the torpedo tubes, which is actually something other regional submarine forces cannot do. Indonesia has bought some corvettes. Interestingly enough, these are actually outfitted with Chinese missiles as well as French Exocets, showing that there is a growing Indonesian-Chinese military relation going on. At the same time, the Indonesians are getting very close to the South Koreans. They bought some of these large LPDs. These are actually based on commercial hulls with a military superstructure. And again, like Singapore and Malaysia, they've trying very hard in recent years to recapitalize their submarine force. This has been a rather interesting saga for them. A couple of years ago, it looked like they were going to buy some Russian subs. The Russians actually made some export credits available to the Indonesians to buy them. But the deal fell apart when the Indonesians said, can we use the export credits to build a submarine base? Which the Russians said no. So they sort of floundered a little bit, and the latest now is they're going to get probably a combination of a few used submarines from the South Koreans, some German Type 209, which is a pretty good thing. Plus, the South Koreans say they're going to come in and build a submarine construction facility. Now, the big question, of course, how many submarines will they end up building? Because if they only build one or two, it's a waste of money. So it's very likely that the Indonesians will try, if they can afford it, to actually acquire a considerable fleet of submarines. Just a few other countries. Vietnam, I think the most important thing, again, to note is about 3-4 years ago, they announced that they're going to buy 6 Kilo-class submarines from the Russians. Again, acquiring a capability that they did not possess previously. The Thais operate the only aircraft carrier in the region. It's what we call a pocket carrier. It's pretty small. It was built by the Spanish. It came with some Harrier jump jets, which are largely believed to be inoperable, so it's basically one of the world's biggest helicopter carriers. But it has been used sometimes in humanitarian assistance missions. Brunei is getting some offshore patrol vessels. And the interesting thing is the Philippines, which has historically been like the sick man of Southeast Asia when it's come to its military, has actually in the recent years really tried to make an effort to acquire some larger things. They've gotten some ex-U.S. Coast Guard cutters, which have become essentially their largest ships in their Navy, some offshore patrol vessels, some LPDs, and even they have talked about submarines, although we're still waiting on that. And certainly what you can say is there has been a significant expansion in the quality of the types of weapon systems that are coming into Southeast Asian navies. And if I had more time, I could say this is also being matched by similar acquisitions within air and ground forces, in particular the acquisition of very modern fighter jets such as Su-30s and F-16s, Gripen fighters from Sweden, etc., etc. Now, the question, like I say then, is all this constituting an arms race? And the reason why people generally ask is, an arms race has in and of itself very negative connotations. Generally when you hear of arms race, you think of a process of arms irrational. It's a futile, if not a counterproductive effort, because it doesn't really create security, it only undermines it. But, you have to go a little bit further as to how do you know you're in an arms race. And in this regards, I actually put on my academic hat and I go to some of the theories about arms races that are laid out by people like Colin Gray or Grant Hammond. And I'm not going to run down the list. This is actually kind of a condensed version. But the point that often comes out with arms races is that countries see themselves in an explicit antagonistic relationship with other nations, and their arming is specifically and openly made in response to what they see another country doing. And so I think that's very important things to note, and the fact that you have to come out and actually say that we are in an arming process because we have concerns over this country or that country or this. And so when you do that, one of the things that in particular as a subset of this is I'm often asked, is there a submarine arms race? And again, just to reiterate, you have countries like Singapore, Malaysia, Vietnam, Indonesia, and maybe even Thailand, which either didn't have any submarines at all, like 10 years ago, 15 years ago, or had maybe one or two extremely old and obsolete. And when you see the acquisition of submarines, which have a considerable capabilities and stealthiness and can be used in a variety of means, from intelligence to special forces insertion and things like that. This is something that people are very concerned about. And the other concern, of course, is that we've only seen the beginning, and that you'll see countries like Malaysia and Indonesia, Thailand, which will not only acquire, but will continue to acquire more and more submarines. And so you could have a lot of them bumping around each other in Southeast Asia. But the question is it really an arms race? And one of the criticisms that I have about people like Colin Gray and Grant Hammond is it's almost overly defined. It's almost too constricted, their definitions of an arms race. And in fact, if you use their characteristics as a kind of a laundry list, you actually find in history very, very few instances of what they would call an arms race. Obviously between the U.S. and USSR during the Cold War, there was an arms race, particularly a nuclear arms race. You might argue that there's an arms race maybe between China and Taiwan. Maybe not. You would expect that if Taiwan really saw itself in an arms race, that they would be buying a lot more stuff than they have. Like I say, there's too much emphasis on inferring adversarial intentions, misperceiving, discounting, etc. So in general, it's very hard for me to see an arms race per se. You don't see the openly adversarial relationships within ASEAN. Again, as I point out, the interesting thing about ASEAN is, despite the fact that these countries certainly have good cause to maybe be suspicious of each other, they will never actually express these. They certainly do not ever base openly their defense strategies or defense policies on their concerns about other ASEAN states. Singapore doesn't say we arm explicitly in order to defend ourselves against a Malaysian threat. They may nudge you in the ribs and say, we know what we're talking about here, but on the other hand, it doesn't fit the criteria to say it's an arms race. The other side of the coin is a lot of countries in Southeast Asia aren't even players. If you look at Brunei, you look at Burma, you look at, Cambodia, Laos, even the Philippines, they barely have defense spending of any real numbers, and their acquisition rates are extremely small and minor. So where does that leave us? Well, there's these two guys, Buzan and Herring, who have written about something they call the arms dynamic, or some people call the arms competition, in which you still see countries maybe buying weapons in a action-reaction, a tit-for-tat cycle, depending on what their neighbors are doing. But it's not unlike an arms race trying to gain an edge, a military edge over your regional players, but rather trying to keep the status quo as they see it balanced. In other words, it's trying to create stability rather than gain hegemony or superiority. Now, is that an arms race or an arms dynamic? And I think it probably fits Buzan and Herring's definition of an arms dynamic, especially when we look at the fact that these aren't particularly large numbers involved. The other side of the thing is that, that's within Southeast Asia. The other side is China perhaps driving this? And I think it's really still hard to say at this point. Again, no country in Southeast Asia, except maybe Vietnam and the Philippines, has really explicitly labeled their acquisition process as in response to what they see as growing Chinese presence and, dare I even say, aggression in the South China Sea. Most countries still don't use that criteria. However, it is possible that this will become a more and more conscious and overt rationale for arming, particularly, I think, if we look at the types of weapon systems and platforms that might be acquired over the next decade, more submarines and maybe more large surface combatants. There are, of course, other reasons why countries are buying weapons. Again, going back to the regional political military balancing, other issues such as pride and prestige. There's a lot of countries, particularly in the region, which buy weapon systems because that's what you do if you're a military. And frankly, to sort of, not to make too big of a deal about it, but the issue of corruption is something that cannot be discounted either. In a lot of countries, a lot of arms acquisitions are not made because of rational decisions that these are militarily useful, but because certain amounts of monies have exchanged under the table that basically lead to the decision to acquire these weapon systems. And so we have a lot of other rationales that are perhaps driving the acquisition process. Again, like I say, I see more of an arms competition in Southeast Asia. And by extension, I think, for example, you could probably see an arms competition within, say, the South Korean and Japanese arms acquisition process. So then the question is this, is this process of military and particularly naval modernization potentially destabilizing? If it's not an arms race, what is it? If it's arms competition, is it still something that we should perhaps be concerned about? And I think in two cases that I would argue yes. In the first place, the process of modernization has resulted in the introduction of new military capabilities into regional militaries. Okay? If you look at particularly the navies, and how they have progressed over the last 15 years from basically small coastal-oriented defense forces to ones that are more capable of projecting power, of operating further away from their shores, of having more firepower through things like anti-ship cruise missiles or better guns, the introduction of stealth in the area of submarines, or even in some cases warships. What this does is this introduces new capabilities into the regional military security calculus and therefore can complicate it. What this also leads to is perhaps increased arms competitions, or at least as part of this, and this can have unintended consequences, of course. I mean, one of the problems with the arms dynamic, as even Buzan and Herring points out, is that it can have the unintended consequence of actually undermining the very security that your arming is seeking to enhance. The so-called security dilemma that Jervis has talked about, and the spiral effect. That is, tit-for-tat arming actually can create suspicions and uncertainties. And therefore, that means that if there is conflict in the South China Sea, for example, it's most likely going to be much more high-tech than it would have been a few years ago. In other words, there's going to be more lethal and potentially more devastating in its effect. To try and end on an up note, I always say is, well, you could also say that these new pieces of equipment, if used correctly, could actually become stabilizers. Certainly they give countries the capabilities for deterrence, for contributing to humanitarian assistance and disaster relief and other types of contingencies. And certainly from the standpoint of the U.S. military, it provides opportunities for improved interoperability.
Richard A. Bitzinger there, a senior fellow with the Military Transformations Program at the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies in Singapore.
That's part one.
The rearming process in the South China Sea goes beyond mere modernisation of regional militaries and could greatly alter the nature and character of future regional conflicts. You're with Big Ideas.